Let's talk about basic geometric figures. In this video, we'll be covering points, lines, rays, segments, and planes. They are 5 of the simplest yet most important figures in geometry. Points have no dimension. That means they don't have a length or a width, you can't measure them, they're just a single point in space. Whereas lines, rays, and segments exist in 1 dimension, so they do have a length. In other words, you could measure them, like with a ruler. And planes exist in 2 dimensions, which means they have both a length and a width. First, let's talk about how to name a point. Points are by far the easiest figure to deal with in geometry, because it's just a single letter that you use to name it. So I could call this point A. Or you could even just call it A. The word point is optional. Lines look like this. By definition, they're an infinite collection of points, which extend without end in 2 directions. To represent the fact that they extend infinitely, we put arrows on both ends of the figure. Now, a common mistake that I see my students making is drawing lines like this, with the arrowheads in between the points. Please do not draw your lines with the arrows like that. You should draw your arrows on the exterior of those outermost points, like what you see in the figure on the screen right now. There are 2 different ways to name a line. The first option is to use any 2 points on the line, written in any order, with a line drawn on top. The second option is to use a lowercase cursive letter to name the line instead. You can tell the difference between points on the line and just a generic name for the line like L, because points are capital letters, and if it's a point, then it's going to have a small circle next to that letter. So A, B, and C are points, because they're capitalized and because each of those letters are next to a circle on the line. Whereas L is a lowercase cursive letter that's not directly next to a circle on the line, and therefore it's just a generic name to refer to the line. So here are my options. I could call this figure line L, or AC, AB, BC, CA, BA, or CB. Any one of those 6 options would be correct, because each of them is just a combination of any 2 points on the line with a line drawn on top of those 2 letters. Let's talk about some examples of incorrect names for this line. For example, you cannot call this line ABC. Lines are always named with 2 points on the line, never 3. So just because you see 3 points on the line doesn't mean that you should use all 3 of them to name the line. Just pick any 2 of the 3 and draw a line on top. AL is another example of an incorrect name, because it combines the 2 different naming conventions. Either pick 2 points on the line, A, B, or C in this case, or use the lowercase cursive letter and call it just plain old line L. You cannot combine both points and the lowercase cursive letter into one name. That would be incorrect. And another example of an incorrect name would be AC with a segment on top. Notice that the symbol that I put on top of those 2 letters doesn't have arrows. That doesn't match the kind of figure that we have drawn, and therefore it would be incorrect. The line above the letters has to have arrows. Now let's talk about rays. Rays are an infinite collection of points that extends without end in only 1 direction, which is different than a line. Lines extended in both directions. Rays only go in 1 direction. So as you can see on this figure, one side of it has an arrow, and the other side doesn't. That's what makes it a ray. One side goes forever, the other side does not. To name a ray, you must write the endpoint's name first, then followed by any other point on the ray. And those 2 letters must be topped off with a ray. You should draw the type of figure that you see above the letters. Just like how we did on lines, we drew a line on top of the letters. With rays, you'll draw a ray on top of the letters, like so. These are the only 2 correct names that you could give to this ray because they both start with the endpoint's name. The endpoint is D. And then I wrote one of the other 2 points on that ray. So I can either call this DE or I can call it DF, and both of those names have a ray pointing to the right written on top. Some examples of incorrect names would be FD. This is incorrect because the little ray written on top of the letters is pointing the wrong direction, and because the endpoint wasn't written first. You have to write D first, no negotiating. Endpoint is always first. You also cannot call this ray DEF, because rays are only named with 2 points on the ray, never 3. And you also cannot call this DF. It's almost correct, except it's missing an arrow on the symbol written above the letters. Now let's talk about segments. A segment is an infinite collection of points, but it's confined between 2 endpoints. So you'll notice there's no arrows here. It does not go forever in one direction or both directions. It is confined between point G and point I. To name a segment, you have to use the names of the endpoints. And on top of those letters, you will write a segment, which has no arrowheads. So the only 2 names that you could give to this segment are GI and IG. I cannot use H when I'm naming this segment because H is not an endpoint of the segment, it's just some random point in between the endpoints. To name a segment, you have to use the points on the end. So GH would be incorrect. So would IH and HI and HG. You can't use H to name this segment because it's not an endpoint. You also cannot call it GHI, just like with rays and lines. You name a segment with 2 points, never 3. And you can't put arrows on the symbol on top of the letters because that would indicate that it's a line, that it continues forever left and right of point G and point I, and it doesn't. It ends at point G and point I, and therefore there should be no arrows. Finally, let's talk about planes. A plane is going to be a little bit different than lines and rays and segments because it exists in 2 dimensions. To draw a plane, we typically draw a parallelogram, but we have to imagine that the plane itself extends beyond the edges of that parallelogram. Planes are infinite. They go forever in 2 directions, left and right and up and down. And a parallelogram has edges. So you have to imagine that there aren't edges, that it continues forever. There's 2 different ways to name a plane. You can either write the word plane and then 3 non-collinear points on the plane in any order, or you can write the word plane and then a single uppercase cursive letter. So for example, looking at this diagram, I could call it plane P. And you'll notice that that P is not a point. I can tell that P is not a point for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, it's not directly next to a little black circle on the plane, so it's not representing a point. And reason number 2 is because it's that fancy cursive font, which indicates that it's just a generic name to refer to that entire plane without using individual points on the plane. So I can either call it plane P, or I can call it plane and then any combination of 3 of those 4 letters. So plane JKL, plane MLK, plane LMJ, and many, many other names. So let's look at some examples. For each of these, I want you to tell me, what is it? Is it a point? Is it a line? Is it a ray? Is it a segment? Is it a plane? And then I want you to give it a name. And for the record, when I say give it a name, I don't mean call it George or Xavier or Veronica. I mean tell me a geometrically correct name for that figure based on the points that you see on the figure. So first, what is this? Well, I would say it's a ray. The reason I say it's a ray is because one end of it has an endpoint and the other end of it has an arrow. So that means that it goes from this endpoint at X and extends in one direction through Z and beyond forever. By definition, that makes it a ray. In order to name a ray, you have to write the endpoint's name first. So no matter what name I choose to give this, X has to be written first. And then after that, I'll write either of these 2 points next. So I can either call it XZ or XY. And both of these names I wrote a ray pointing to the right on top of the letters. So these are the 2 correct names that I could give to this ray. My next example has arrows on both sides. That makes this a line. Remember that lines are the easiest one-dimensional figure to name because they're not very picky. You just pick any 2 points on the line and write a line on top of it. It doesn't matter which ones you pick, and it doesn't matter what order you write them in, just pick any 2 points, like UW or VU or WV, whatever you want, and write a line on top. So all 6 of those answers at the bottom of your screen would be correct. Our next example is actually the same line, but instead of having points drawn on it, we have a lowercase cursive letter. So that means that this could be called line M, and that's it. So sometimes you'll see lines like this that have points, and sometimes you'll see lines like this that have no points and instead just have a lowercase cursive letter that we can use to name it. Next up, this figure has no arrows, just a line and some points. That makes it a segment. And in order to name a segment, you have to use the endpoints. It doesn't matter what order you write those endpoints in, but you have to use the points on the end. In other words, S is not going to be used when I name this segment because S is not an endpoint. It's just some random point in between those 2 endpoints. So the only correct names that I could give to this figure are RT or TR. And you'll notice that on top of each of those 2 letters, I wrote a segment, which is just a straight line with no arrows. I think identifying this figure is probably the easiest because it looks the most different from all the others. This is a plane. And there are a few different names that we could give to it. I could call it plane and then any combination of 3 of the 4 points that I see on that plane. Or I could call it plane R. R is different than the other 4 letters that you see because it's not a point. It's not directly next to a little black circle, so it's not a point. And also it's that pretty cursive font, which indicates that it is just a generic name to refer to that plane. So those are 4 examples of how I could name this plane, but there are many others, depending on how you want to combine P and Q and S and N. These last few examples, I want you to draw a certain figure. Now, if you don't have paper and pencil handy, that's totally fine, just draw it in your mind. But I want you to be able to imagine what each of these figures look like. So first up, we're asked to draw ray JK. Okay, well, what does a ray look like? A ray has an endpoint on one side and an arrow on the other. Something kind of like that. Now remember that the name of a ray, the first letter of it, is always the endpoint's name. So the endpoint, I'm going to call that J. And then the second letter in the ray's name is some other point on the ray. So I'm going to put K right there. And ta-da! I made ray JK. Now let's draw a segment BD. Okay, what does a segment look like? It's just a straight line with no arrows. And if the name of that segment is BD, then that means one of the endpoints is B and the other endpoint is D. So I'm going to draw my segment to look like this. And last, let's draw a plane. Remember that planes are represented by parallelograms, so draw a shape that looks something like this. And then to make it plane FZN, you need to draw 3 points on that plane and call them F and Z and N. And now you know the basics about points, lines, rays, segments, and planes.